Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from New York Community Bank, Capital One Bank, Eastern Consolidated, M&T Bank, Sterling National Bank, Meridian Capital Group, Customers Bank, Aerial Property Advisors, Dime Community Bank, Perfect Building Maintenance. Additional funding has been provided by AKA Hotels Corman Communities, AmTrust Title Insurance Company, AVR Realty Company, Avison Young, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, CBRE, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Chase Mortgage Lending, JP Morgan Chase, Citizens Bank, Cohen Equities, Colliers International NYC, Collins Building Services, Connect One Bank, CPEX Real Estate Services, Douglaston Development, Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Handler Real Estate Organization, Handro Properties, Hodges Ward Elliott, Inc., Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, Kilroy Architectural Windows, Madison Realty Capital, Matone Group, Mercantile Bank, New Banks, Newmark Knight Frank, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Polsinelli, Rockefeller Group, Rosewood Realty Services, SJP Properties, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, the Knackle Group at Cushman & Wakefield, the Merinkoff Family Foundation, the Moynihan Group, and these friends.
Pennsylvania, grocery stores, New Jersey, working in a soda place, making egg creams, typing. Grandpa says, you know, a doctor would be good in the family. I'm going to be a doctor. I want to help people. Franklin Lakes High School, Paris, Princeton for engineering? Oh, Phi Beta Kappa, summa cum laude. Columbia University School of Physicians and Surgeons, MPH, orthopedic surgeon, pediatric author, chief medical officer. All of a sudden, the COO of a 10-hospital, 40,000 employee, $10 million operation. I have Dr. Laura Forese. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
We have the two sides of the family. Let's tell me about the Italian side and then tell me about the Polish side, how they came here and how they met.
Sure. Well, I'm so very fortunate to be from these two big families. My grandfather came to this country when he was a teenager, very poor, from a section of Italy, Abruzzi, and came because there really was no future for him as he saw it. He came to Pennsylvania and came to people that he knew, first to work in the steel industry just to get a job, and eventually settled, met my grandmother and settled, and they did what they knew, which was food.
And we have that great picture of the Forese grocery or the general food store.
Yeah.
And where was that located?
So that was in a town called Coatesville, Pennsylvania. It's where my father grew up, and both of my grandparents had very little, almost no education, but they were street smart, and they really valued education, sent all three of their sons to college.
Tell me about Grandma.
Yes. Oh, Grandma, she was amazing. She was just this incredible cook, and she was tough, but she had a heart of just gold. So she was born in this country, and she was in Western Pennsylvania and met my grandfather and then moved with him. She was quite a bit younger, and again, always valued. She would be, both of my grandparents would always say, you know, we gotta have a doctor in this family. Someone has to be the doctor in the family, because that was always viewed as that professional. We really want to make sure that we've arrived, and that was kind of the American dream for them.
So Dad goes to RPI.
RPI, yeah.
Up in Rochester, and he becomes an engineer.
Well, he studied engineering, but he really was always a business person.
Because then he went to MIT also.
Right, he got his business degree there.
So how did he end up leaving Pennsylvania and coming to?
Well, my father went to RPI. He met my mother, who herself was first generation to college. She was at Albany Teachers College. They met when they were in college, and then they followed my dad's business career for years. And that's really, again, my mother was a big proponent of education. She herself studied teaching, and she did that until she left to raise a family.
So let's talk about the little girl who was born in 1961.
Did you have to bring up?
Of course
that,
I had to, you know.
Right. These days you can't hide your age anywhere, because it's all over the internet.
And Suffern, right?
I was born in Suffern, yes.
Suffern, New York. Dad was working for IBM.
Yes.
So tell me about growing up, because it was Suffern, and then, as I was saying, you know, growing up, there was Paris and other things. Tell me about the
well,
early...
my dad worked for IBM, and so we followed his career. We spent a couple years abroad, just outside of Paris, when my father was working for IBM Europe. That was a fantastic experience for my entire family. And then we settled eventually in Franklin Lakes, New Jersey, and that's where I went to high school.
And that's where your daughters went.
That's where I raised my family with my husband.
So let's talk about growing up in Franklin Lakes.
Great place to grow up. I went to public schools. They were terrific schools. It was a wonderful town, and I couldn't wait to leave it to go to college.
When we got together, and also in some articles, it said that when you were a kid, you wanted to be a physician. You wanted to help people. It was partially Grandpa said he wanted a doctor,
right.
But you wanted that.
I always wanted to be a doctor, and it's a funny thing because I didn't have any doctors in the family, but I knew what doctors did, and I understood that that was a valuable career and that you could really help people. And so I had that in my head. Now, a lot of little kids have that in their heads, but I kept that all the way through, and it has been an incredibly rewarding career.
So before we talk about graduating from Franklin Lakes, few people would know about the job that you had in that luncheonette.
I worked in a luncheonette. That's right. I worked in a luncheonette.
Luncheonette, which was the pre-Starbucks.
I was right. There was no such thing.
That's correct.
Then cups of coffee were 50 cents.
Right. So you had coffee, and you were a waitress, right?
I was absolutely a waitress, and what a valuable job that was for me. And people ask me about what were my most important jobs. I always talk about that one. I worked some days after school and very early in the morning on Saturdays, and we were there as a luncheonette really for blue-collar workers. So a lot of truckers would stop in, or people who were on their way to other jobs, and I was delighted if someone would leave me a dime or a quarter as a tip. And I'll tell you what I got out of that job was just how hard it is to work on your feet. So the short order cook, who was this wonderful man that obviously I spent a lot of time with in those hours, really had a very difficult life, and I came to appreciate through that experience really how challenging work can be, and how fortunate I was to be going on to college and then to a career in which I wasn't having perhaps to stand on my feet all day.
So how did you decide to go to Princeton, where you're a trustee today?
So at the time, I was thinking, of course, about medicine, but my father, as you said, had studied engineering, and he really instilled in me and my siblings what a valuable education that was. Princeton had a terrific, still does, a terrific engineering school, and so that's how I ended up choosing Princeton, knowing that I would hopefully go on to medicine, but be able to have that engineering background.
What do you do during the summers?
Well, I spent my time in the early summers at working at the luncheonette and doing sports.
Right, and then didn't you also do typing?
I did do typing. Typing was one of the things that I did. You know, at the time, I made a lot of money typing papers. We didn't, of course, have PCs or other ways to do it. Everybody typed still on the typewriters, and I had a knack for being able to do that. Sounds so funny now that you could actually do that.
I prefer a typewriter also. So you did that, and engineering and orthopedics, what's the involvement? Because if you have good bones and conditions, what's the relationship with engineering and orthopedics?
Well, there's biomedical engineering, and of course that's critical. In some ways, orthopedics is applying carpentry principles and engineering principles and construction principles to the human body. But when I was studying engineering, I was focusing on things like systems engineering and operations research. So really taking problems and breaking them down. And that's a skill that, frankly, I've been able to use throughout my entire life.
Princeton required a thesis was on what?
So I wrote my thesis on how couples who are going through a high-risk pregnancy, how they make decisions about what types of tests they would do and sort of what's going on in their minds, this whole concept of uncertainty and how people break that down.
So you graduate Princeton what year?
I graduated in 1983.
So it's 1983, and now you go, okay, from New Jersey, you now go to Upper Manhattan.
I didn't go too far, right?
Okay, you didn't go too far, and you start at Columbia School of Physicians and Surgeons, right? So talk to me about your years up at Columbia.
So such an interesting time, the 80s, to be in there, and that neighborhood really started to gentrify, and so you could see that neighborhood changing. But it was an incredible place to be in medical school, in part because just as today, it's a community that really depends on that medical school and that hospital.
Right, the community, besides depending on servicing the people over there, it's creating the financial mechanism for the community because you provide so many jobs.
That's right. That's right. And so it was wonderful to see that community start to change. I lived in the community right up there in Upper Manhattan in Washington Heights during the time that I was in medical school, and that's where I met my husband as well.
Right. He was also at Columbia.
Yes, he was he trained at the Presbyterian Hospital, and he had gone to medical school at Columbia.
When did you decide that you wanted to do a residency in orthopedics?
Well, the way medical school worked then, it's a little bit different today, but you get to your third year of medical school and now you're in the hospital and you're seeing all the different types of specialties, and I liked all of them. That was one of the hardest things to choose. But perhaps because of my engineering background, orthopedics really spoke to me.
But you like pediatric orthopedics. That was something you said to me.
I do like pediatric orthopedics. So first of all, orthopedics is a specialty where you can make major changes in someone's life, and they really can benefit and benefit quickly. And for children, you can impact someone early on in their life and have that change the course of their entire life. And kids are just wonderful, the types of things that you could do. So it was my real privilege to train in that specialty.
Now, I know that currently, and it's been happening for years, there was the match program. So you have to match to a place. You were fortunate to match to Columbia.
I was. And the match actually is, again, a terrific math problem, an engineering problem, I might say, where people put down their requests for where they'd like to train, and the training programs put down their list of students and whom they would like to train, and then it's a computer algorithm. And so I was fortunate to be able to stay in New York.
So you match and you go to, you stay at the New-York-Presbyterian.
Right, it was then called Presbyterian.
It was Presbyterian before the merger and before the,
right.
Because the mergers really took place in the 90s.
Yes, actually, we just celebrated the 20-year anniversary of this merger between the Presbyterian Hospital and the New York Hospital.
Right. During your residency, you made a decision. You worked for a great doctor. You said Harold?
I worked for a really wonderful man whose name was Harold Dick, Dr. Harold Dick. He was my chairman in orthopedic surgery, and I credit him with so many things in my career since then. He was a wonderful mentor. At the time, there were not a lot of women in orthopedic surgery, and he was someone who always said to me, you can do this, you'll be able to really focus on an area, a field that that you love. And he's the one who gave me my first job after training.
Now, you were married when you were in your residency.
Yes.
Okay. And when you finished your residency, you had the twins, right?
Yes, I had my twins.
So there was a question of maternity leave, and we'll figure it out, right? There was something about
Yes.
that, and it really relates to something that you've implemented for the Presbyterian,
Sure.
New York Presbyterian system today. Let's talk about that.
Well, so my daughters were born when I was an orthopedic surgery resident. And at the time, so this is back in 1990, there were not real rules around these training programs and maternity leave. I was very fortunate because, as I said, I was working under the leadership of Hal Dick, and he was the one who said, we'll figure this out. And I was lucky because I was having twins and I needed some time off, but it always stuck in my head that there really ought to be a program that would say, here's a maternity leave program. Now fast forward to just this past year at New York Presbyterian Hospital, where we have thousands of employees and thousands of people who are training. We put a program in place. We've had maternity leave now for a while, but this year we put in paid parental leave. So now mothers and fathers now can take some time with their newborn.
Like up to 6 weeks?
Yes. So for the primary parent, it's 6 weeks of paid leave. It's often the birth mother. And for the other parent, it's 2 more weeks. So
how did you decide to go to the Mailman School of Public Health?
Again, I go back once again to Hal Dick. You see how influential he was in my career. My husband's also a surgeon. We were waiting for Rob to finish his training, and I took my first faculty job. And it was Dr. Dick who said, why don't you also get a management degree? You like that. Your brain works in that way. And wherever you end up, you'll have an additional credential. So I was working. I had little children, but I went to school, and it was a terrific experience. And that mailman program was outstanding.
So you have an MD, you have an MPH at this time. You're on the faculty of Columbia, which you really loved.
Yes.
And then you get involved with certain practice, and you're also working up in Helen Hayes. Let's talk about that in your orthopedic situation.
Sure. Well, Helen Hayes was a hospital that at the time New York Orthopedic Hospital was working with, and we provided the orthopedic surgery services. It's a state hospital, and it still exists, and so that was one of my assignments. And again, I credit that because part of it was figuring out what we should be doing, how we should be doing it, and I was given that opportunity really to start to manage and lead. So.
Now, during this period of time, you also, as they would say, you were a physician who learned about healthcare first on. What happened?
Well, you're talking about as I was...
When you got sick.
Well, that was an incredible experience for me. So I was still in my 30s, and I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I was fortunate that it was caught early, but I spent about a year with multiple surgeries and chemotherapy and radiation therapy. And I would never wish that experience on anyone to have a significant illness, but for someone like me who's in that field, who then goes through that, no question, it made me think differently about what it's like to have an illness and how patients interact with the system.
And this is before you really got into the administration.
Yes, yes, it was before I really changed my career and
so how did you change your career? How did you decide in 2003 to leave pediatric orthopedics and dedicate yourself full-time to administration of a institution, starting as the chief medical officer?
Yeah, so part of what was going on was that I could see that I was loving the business side of medicine. And while I was at the medical school and I was in my orthopedic surgery department, I was doing more and more in the way of administration. And I loved that. And I could see that as much as I enjoyed working with individual patients, the ability to do something on a larger scale kind of helped me move the needle, if you will. So as I started to look around, I started to think maybe there are other types of ways I could move this career.
Because it's 2003, it's 6 years after the merger, and the merger at the beginning was not an easy merger because most of at least your merger stayed. The NYU Mount Sinai system didn't work. There was difficulties at the Northwell, which, LIJ. What was your first job?
My first job, I came over to work with, in fact, it's the person who's my current boss, Steve Corwin, and he brought me over to work for the hospital as the Vice President for Medical Affairs, working with the medical board and a lot of the physicians, and it was a job that kind of let me cut my teeth on administration in hospitals.
And the next one was what?
Well, then I had a series of jobs.
I know,
so
let's talk about the series of jobs.
I was the chief medical officer, and then Steve asked me to be the chief operating officer at what was the Weill Cornell Center.
Right, so you left the west side to really go to the east side.
Right.
To the sister. And during at that institution, besides being the chief operating officer, you also got involved with a lot of, because some of the successful mergers or involvements. I mean, you were involved with Methodist.
Right. So over time, what started to happen for New York Presbyterian was that it was clear that this was a merger that didn't just stick, it worked. And the board did a fantastic job of really putting it together and making it make sense for our patients, the physicians, all of the employees. And over time, we really were able to start to think about expanding. So it was about 5 years ago that New York Presbyterian could now look around. And we started with what ultimately became Lower Manhattan Hospital.
Which went through many gyrations of institution relationship. And today, it's such an important figment of Lower Manhattan because of the growth of what's happening in Lower Manhattan. It's important.
And very busy and thriving and an important part of the New York Presbyterian
It used to be a stepchild
enterprise.
for everybody because it was lost.
It's not today. Boy, we love what's going on down there.
So
today.
that was one. And then there was Queens, more of a relationship with the
Queens and Brooklyn Methodist, 2 hospitals in Westchester, and that was one of my jobs along the way, was to kind of put those pieces together and to really work with the local teams to help them understand why it would make sense to join this system.
Then you were also involved with the healthcare group, the medical.
Right. So part of adding these additional hospitals to the New York Presbyterian enterprise were that we had some doctors who were employed by those hospitals. And we're fortunate because we have 2 terrific medical schools that we work with, Columbia and Weill Cornell. They have big doctor practices, a lot of focus on specialists and specialties. And so now thinking about our expansion, which we've done very much in lockstep with each of them, has also brought with us additional physicians. And so now New York Presbyterian has a medical group, a lot of which is primary care.
Let's talk about when the branding to the New York Pres system. Even though there are the 2 hospitals, it's the branding and something that you and Steve take, and all the administration, this camaraderie and openness.
Yeah. Well, for starters, and this is not true when you look at certain hospital systems across the country, when we've partnered with a hospital and when we've taken it on, we've said, look, it's got to be a visible symbol to the patients that we care for. And the most important thing is how we brand and put our name on hospitals. So Methodist Hospital is a good example in Brooklyn. When we brought that fully into New York Presbyterian, we've decided to call it New York Presbyterian Brooklyn Methodist Hospital. And it's been true of all of our hospitals. And that name signifies something. In fact, our board was quite adamant about the need to do that and really to affirm that. But it also made us really think about, as you get bigger, what is at the heart of who you are and what's the culture of the organization. And we've spent a lot of time talking about the New York Presbyterian culture of respect. Now that's something that every employee, I think, takes to heart, but we had to really begin with saying, well, what does that mean? Because respect might mean one thing to me and something different to someone else. So we actually started with a credo. So the New York Presbyterian credo very simple language, so one-page piece of paper, what we believe in, what we will do, and what we won't do. And it starts with every person and every voice counts. And that's been important to our frontline staff because it means the same thing for the person who is in the housekeeping department as it does for the neurosurgeon.
Let's talk about family a little bit. You're married, your husband's a cardiothoracic surgeon?
Yes. My husband and I are so fortunate. We're married 29 years. And probably the best thing that's happened to us have been these three wonderful kids. So our twin daughters, Megan and Caitlin.
And what are they doing today?
So Megan works for a startup here in New York, and Caitlin works on the West Coast for Google.
And one of the greatest things that you had was when the graduation, especially
Yes.
being a trustee at Princeton
Yes.
University and having your daughters graduate. That was interesting.
It was an incredible privilege to be able to see them.
And then you have a
graduate.
son.
And I have a son who's a senior in college.
Where is he?
He's a senior at Princeton.
Okay, keeping the tradition over there.
Keeping the tradition alive.
And Dad's in Washington, right?
My dad still is working well into his 80s, and he works in private equity and is still sharp as a tack.
You're the chief operating officer of a 10-hospital, 40,000 employee institution, but the board is so important to you.
Well, we always are so, we talk about this all the time, we are so fortunate at New York-Presbyterian to have this board. And again, as I talk to my peers around the country, people don't have boards like we do. So we have titans of industry and all different kinds of industry. That's the tremendous advantage we have about being here in New York. But the other thing that I know from talking to my colleagues across the country is that our board is very involved, and it's been incredibly helpful to us. I go back to this merger. I said this merger would not have been successful without the board at the time, and they all take their role very seriously.
So all of this, you're in the top 25 healthcare leaders by Modern Healthcare. You're in the I think you're number 12 by the Women Empowerment at Cranes, okay? You're on the board of a public company. You're also the chair of an NIH Hospital Foundation.
Of the hospital at NIH in Bethesda.
Right. And you still operate and see the family and travel. So,
well, what I don't do is care for patients anymore, and that was an important part.
I think you're still caring for patients in a different way.
Yes, that's how I say it, and that's a privilege to be able to interact with families all the time. Look, one of the things that I've learned along the way is how important it is to have great teams, to have people to work with, and that's been true for me in my personal life with first my parents and then my husband and children, and also very true for me at work.
And I'd like to thank you for being here today.
It's been my privilege. Thank you.